So I want us to examine further the blessed condition in which man was made. The classic text that I like to use to make this case is to be found in the book of Ecclesiastes. The last verse of chapter 7. Now, of course, you know the preacher who writes this, much of this, was a man who, Ecclesiastes 7:29. Mhubiri 7:29. Mhubiri 7:29. He's a man who has gone on a research. I mean, he's examined many things, and so at certain stages, he tells us what he has found out. So, again, largely, so you find that phrase, I found this out, he says. I found this out, he says. I found this out, he says. Now here's what he says in verse 9. See, this alone I found, that God made man upright. But they have sought out many schemes. God made man upright. Now that's a summary of the condition of mankind when God made him. Now that word upright means he was, the Swahili word is mnyofu, sio? Mfanya mtu mnyofu. No crooked places, no bends, no corners, no defilement. And this is the preacher's way of saying that when God made man, man was perfect. When God made man, man was perfect. He was made in perfect conditions. There was nothing wrong with him at all. There were no seeds of failure in him. None. God made man upright. So I want us to examine then, first of all, the state in which God made man. And I want to borrow from an old writer. He's a Puritan writer. I tend to confuse his name. His name is Thomas, his first name. And he's either Thomas Manton or Thomas Boston. I confuse those things very often. Yeah, but he wrote a book titled Human Nature in its Fourfold State. And so he traces the 4 stages of mankind's existence. So man in the state of innocence, okay? And then man, I think, in the state of nature, all right? So innocence, nature, and then man in the state of grace, and then man in the state of glory. Some of those are paraphrases, but those are the ideas. So he traces the development of mankind, or the journey of mankind, from the state of innocence to the state of glory, what it was when God first made him, what it will be in the new heaven and the new earth. But in between here, there are 2 other stages. The state of nature, that is what mankind is by nature after the fall, and then the state of grace, what happens to him when he becomes a Christian. Okay. So there are three stages. And so there's this discussion he has about man in the state of innocence. Man as he came from the hand of God, when it was a brand new thing, God just made him. How did he look like? What were some of the blessings that he had? So that writer says 3 things. He describes the blessedness of man, or the perfection of man's state, in 3 ways. First of all, it says that man's understanding, his understanding was a lamp. Lamp the U of A. See? A lamp of light. That's how it describes man's intellectual capacities. That man had knowledge. That's what we said, part of the image of God in man. That he knew. Everything he ought to have known, he knew. Everything he needed to know, he knew. So his understanding was a lamp of light. In other words, his understanding could figure out whatever it needed to figure out. There was no darkness in his mind. You remember, when Paul now describes us in our fallen condition, he describes our understanding as being darkened. Yeah. Not when it was meant. Yesterday we were talking about conscience. And we read a passage in, I think, Proverbs 20, verse 7. Yeah. Which says that the spirit of man is the lamp of the Lord. It searches out everything. Yeah. So everything that man needed to know, he knew. What he ought to have known, he knew. So man knew himself as he ought to have known himself. Man knew God as he ought to have known God. Now, we are not suggesting that man had exhaustive knowledge, because omniscience is an attribute of God alone. Yeah. But man knew everything that he needed to know. Everything that he ought to have known, he knew. His understanding was a lamp of light. Now, I think there's a good example of man's capabilities, intellectual capabilities, when God first made him, that we find captured in Genesis chapter 2. Some of you know what I'm alluding to. But do you notice then that in Genesis 2, when God creates man, forms him out of the dust of the ground, breathes into his nostril the breath of life, becomes a living creature. God plants a garden in Eden, in the east. He puts man there. Okay? And then the garden is described in various ways. Very beautiful. Then God gives man the command, verse 15, 17. And then God declares that it's not good for man to be alone. Okay? It's not good for him to be alone. So I will make a helper made for him. Now, in the preparation for the making of a helper for man, God does something. So he said it's not good for man to be alone. So, meaning God created man with a need. God identifies that need. And now God is going to make that need clear to man. So how does he make it clear to man? Look at verse 19. Now out of the ground the Lord had formed every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens. And God brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. Rather, that was its name. The man gave names to all livestock and to all the birds of the heavens and to every beast of the field. Okay? And then, but for Adam, there was not found a helper fit for him. So how does God bring an awareness of man's need for a woman? Now, of course, we're going to say that up until that point, that awareness wasn't there. Okay? Because it was not part of what constituted what he ought to have known. Right? Remember I said man did not know all things because not omniscient. But everything he ought to have known, he knew. Right? Yeah. Now, so God is going to bring an awareness. But even the way that awareness comes is interesting. So God has determined, I will make a helpmate for him. But first of all, God brings all the animals and they pass before the man. And as man names these animals, he gets everything right. So there was no help of him. You see how the realization comes. Eh? Yeah. I actually need a partner as well. Yeah. It just clicks. Once that happens, and then it clicks to him. Yeah. So there's this aptness to grasp things even. Eh? Yeah. Yeah. He's very apt to grasp. So once God has done that, and then God leaves things there, and then now God puts him to sleep, and then God makes the woman out of the man, and then God brings the woman to the man, and then what does God tell man? Here's your wife. Yeah? As soon as the wife comes, it's clicked. Now, it's like the process of bringing things before mankind was paused for a moment. Paused. Not complete. And then God makes a woman. And then when he brings her, now things are complete. So when that process was paused, Adam knew there's something missing here. Okay? God also brings something about a letter, you go to happen. And then he's put to sleep. Wakes up, he sees the woman, and nobody tells me. He just apprehends. This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my. He knows where this thing is coming from. Even though the work was done when he was asleep. He knows, he will talk up. And she shall be called woman. So that's the first name that Adam gives to Eve. Woman. Why? Because she was taken out of a man. Now later on in chapter 3, Adam is going to give his wife another name. After the fall, Eve. And why? That's because she's the mother of all the living. Now, but let's just look at how man names these creatures. And sometimes you've got to wonder them. So how many creatures did God make? How many things did God create? Especially if you realize that God rested on the seventh day. Yeah? So are there any new species of things that things have multiplied? But God pretty much completed his creation. And then every animal, every living thing that God has made, he brings it before man. And man gives it a name. And not once do we find God correcting. Oh, no, this one is, no. The Bible says, whatever mankind called it, that is all it was. Now, that gains added significance when you realize the revelation of the rest of the Bible, how significant names are in the Bible. Names aren't just names. Names aren't just something to help us to identify something. So you can say, no. Names are more than that. Naming in the Bible is descriptive. So when you name something, it means you've examined it, and you've analyzed it, and you've captured its essence. So you name it. So when God wants to work with Abraham, he changes his name. He names him accordingly. He's going to be the father of many nations. So he changes his name from exalted father, Abraham, to the father of many nations. The name describes him. Jacob, heel catcher. Israel, one was wrestled with God and man and prevailed. So names have significance. They are descriptive of the item being named. God is very, very particular about names. And so then what you're seeing is, as Adam names these creatures that God has made, and there are millions of them, Adam captures accurately the essence of these creatures. And based on that, he names them. And so Adam could simply look at the creature and he knows exactly what he needs to know about that creature, and he gives it a name that is appropriate to it. Millions. What brain can do that today? Can you do that? Yeah. I'm still struggling to figure out all of your names. Nimeshika nyingi, but some of them I still strong. Maybe one or two. As a nyama mnanyamaza sana. But Adam is dealing with millions of items. And one, he never gets one wrong. And we're not even told that he repeated. Oh, no, nothing like that. He just names them. It tells you of his abilities, his mental, intellectual capacities that he has. And even when the woman is brought to him, it's not like he needs to be taught. No. He simply sees his wife and says, oh, I know exactly. This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman. He had the good sense to not confuse, to take a wife from any of the animals. And people are losing that. They confuse an animal for a wife. So you hear all sorts of things happening. And sometimes they confuse fellow men for a wife. Adam knew better than that. He had perfect knowledge. Yeah. And so that gives us an idea as to what Adam's understanding, ability to collect information, to analyze information, to collect it, relate it, and then arrive at accurate conclusions based on the information he has. It was massive, isn't it? Yeah. That was Adam. His understanding was a lamp of light. And so that knowledge then applied to Adam's knowledge of himself. It applies to knowledge of God, knowledge of his surrounding. Adam knew, among other things, exactly who he was, a creature. He knew exactly who God was, the creator. Adam knew exactly what his duty to God was. In fact, the Bible says the law of God was written in his heart, isn't it? Yeah. That was Adam. His understanding was a lamp of light. Now, we will say later on when we look at the fall of Adam, that one of the great consequences of the fall is what we call the noetic effects of sin. Noetic. Those effects of sin that have to do with man's intellectual capacities. Sin has interfered with it. Man no longer knows as he did. His understanding is no longer a lamp of light. Do you now understand the descriptions of the natural man by Paul in Ephesians 4? Darkened understanding. Yeah? Mind is, he described, those are the noetic effects of the fall. He no longer knows as he should. Says that so, sin is going to affect this. Yeah. Even though he was promised that he would have advanced knowledge if he ate the fruit of the tree, the net effect was now Adam doesn't know as much as he should. His capacities are greatly reduced. So his understanding at creation was a lamp of light, that Puritan writer says. So let's think of man like God created him with a perfect knowledge of the will of God. And that's why the fall is a heinous thing. Adam sinned with a high hand, we say. Adam sinned against knowledge. He went into a hole he could see. To the conscious decision. So as it were, the lights dimmed when he fell. The lights dimmed. Now, our description is as we read in Ephesians 4, verse 16, 17, 18. But the second thing that describes the state of man, the condition of man, when he was created, was that his affections were perfectly aligned with God. His affections. also his affections. When we speak about affections, we are speaking about his feelings. Yeah. His orientation, his inclinations, his heart, and all faculties within him were towards God. His affections were perfectly aligned with or inclined towards God. Yeah. Adam loved the Lord his God with all his heart, mind, strength. Okay. There was nothing in Adam that resented God. Nothing. Nothing. There was nothing in Adam that was opposed to God. Zero. And that is why the whole point of Eden, prior to the fall, and this is implicit in the narrative, was a place of perfect fellowship with God. So Adam is there. He has regular, perfect fellowship with God. Prior to the fall, there is no running away from God. Prior to the fall, there is no hiding from God. Prior to the fall, there is no feelings of shame and guilt. I mean, his affections were perfectly aligned. There was nothing negative. Guilt is the negative feeling. Shame is a negative feeling. Fear, these are negative feelings. And they are negative feelings which arise as a result of the breach that happened between him and God. Yeah. Before he fell, his affections were perfectly aligned. So we hear the man and his wife were naked and were not ashamed. There was no feelings of shame or guilt. As far as their relationship with God was perfectly aligned, there was nothing negative in them. Okay? So their affections, this is what the Lord is basically going to demand, isn't it? To love the Lord your God with all your, to be perfectly aligned in all the expressions of your heart towards God. And Adam had it. He loved God. He loved the things of God. What God told him is good. That's what he loved to do. The way Paul can cut it for that is he delighted in the law of God after the inward man. See, now that you see law and say, problem. We hear law, restrictions. Adam had law and, okay, rejoicing. That was. So his affections were perfectly towards God. Perfectly aligned with God. In other words, there was no sin in him. There was no anti-godness in him. So you put God this way, you put Adam, and he aligns like a ruler. That's how God made him. God made man upright. Upright. And then thirdly, now of course, we know that after the fall, just if I may complete this thought, as I've done the other one. What's the circumstances of the man after the fall? He sees God coming and he runs to embrace him?
He hides himself.
Why? His affections are no longer aligned towards God. He fears him. He's ashamed. He's afraid. Now in chapter 6, we're going to be told in verse 5, every intention of the thought of his heart is only anti-God. Paul tells us the natural man does not accept the things of God. They are foolishness to him. He cannot accept them. Yeah. So there's a radical re-inclining of the affections of man in a direction that is not towards God. It's against God. God made man upright, but he has sought out for himself many devices. So his understanding was a lamp of light. His affections were perfectly aligned to God. And then thirdly, Mr. Martin says, but his will was perfectly agreeable to God. Okay? Now, this means not only were his affections aligned with God, his wants, his decisions, his determinations were always in keeping with that which God wants. The exercise of his will was always in one direction. Yeah. The flow of his affections are in one direction. The exercise of his will are also in one direction. And so where the mind of God is, that's where Adam's mind is. Now see this synergy, this synchrony between Adam and God in terms of even how Adam himself regards his wife. Okay? So God creates the woman for Adam with certain things in mind. And as soon as the woman is brought to Adam, he thinks exactly what God was thinking. See? And he makes exactly the decision that God had made. God had decided the woman is for man. And the man sees the woman and immediately he determines, this is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. God never corrected. The way he exercises decision making is the exercise of his will is now perfectly in alignment with God. That is the state in which God made man. His understanding the lamp of light, his affections perfectly aligned with God, and his will is perfectly aligned with God as well. That's what the preacher means when he says that God made man upright. God made man in his image. Now obviously, if God is going to make any requirements of man, all right, a creature like this is perfectly able to do what God says. Yeah, he is. He's perfectly able to do what God says. I think I want to read for us a statement from the London Baptist Confession that helps us to understand this. The state in which man was made. Yeah, so there's the 19th chapter of the London Baptist Confession, which talks about the law of God. But I want us to understand then that when God makes man like this, and then God is going to put him under certain obligations. Yeah, and we need to see, my point is that man being made like this meant that man was competent to carry out the obligations that he was given. So here's what paragraph 1 of chapter 19 says. God gave to Adam a law of universal obedience written in his heart. A heart that is able to understand that law, isn't it? Affections that are inclined towards God. And a will that is perfectly aligned to the will of God. That is the kind of creature that God gives a law. And a particular precept of not eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, by which is God bound him and all his posterity to a personal, entire, exact, perpetual obedience, promised life upon the fulfilling, and threatening death upon the breach of it. And God endued him with power and ability to keep that law. What we mean by this statement is these three things. When the confession says that God endued Adam at his creation with the power and ability to keep the law that he was given, this is what it means. He could understand the law. There was nothing in him against God to make him want to break it. And the exercise of his will was always in keeping with God's will. So here is a creature that is perfectly able to obey. The test that Adam was given was not an unfair test. It was a very fair test. It was not a class 8 exam being given to a nursery school kid. No. Every necessary preparation has been afforded and then it's put under. So I want us to see the gracious provisions that precede man being put under the covenant and under the requirement. And like I said, the reason I'm unpacking this thing is to pile evidence upon evidence that later will show us how then heinous a crime Adam committed. If you consider all these things, his crime was egregious. His crime was egregious. Okay. So that is the state of righteousness, the state of innocence in which God made man. So one more thing we're going to say, and then perhaps we can take our lunch break. Even though God made man in this state of perfect righteousness with ability to keep the law, this original righteousness in which God made man, this original state of mind, state of heart, state of the will with which man was made, it was perfect, yet losable. Perfect, yet losable. Ameumbwa katika hali ya ukamilifu. Ameumbwa katika hali ya ukamilifu, unyoofu, utakatifu na uhaki, ufahamu. Lakini hali yake hiyo ya ukamilifu na unyoofu inaweza kupotea. Ina uwezo wa kupotea hizo sio. Sasa tuwajuaje kwamba aliumbwa katika hali hiyo ya kuwa na haki kamili ila yenye uwezo wa kupotea? Tunajua hiyo ni kweli kwa sababu aliupoteza sio. That he lost it means it was losable. If it was never losable, angewahi kupoteza. So the fact that he lost it demonstrates that it was in fact losable. So now remember, he has perfect ability to obey God, to keep that condition. But there's also a possibility of losing it. So why does God then make him like this and then put him under a probation, under some law? Because God had ordained that Adam's exercise of all these faculties in the direction of trust and obedience to God is how he is going to attain a confirmation in them. God, having made him like this, yet losable, puts him under a test. And if Adam is going to obey, pass this test, that which he had and was able to lose, he is now going to have and not be able to lose it. Makes sense? Yeah. And God ordained that. Now we know that because our state, the state of man. See, remember Mr. Thomas's discussion on the fourfold state. The final one is going to be the man in his glorified state. And among the other things, in our glorified state, we will be restored to original righteousness and elevated to a point whereby not only do we have it, we will be unable to lose it. Now that was what Adam was supposed to achieve, right? By obeying God in not eating the forbidden fruit. Had he obeyed that, for whatever duration God had in mind, he would have been elevated and confirmed to these things in an unlosable way. Now we'll look at that more when we come to man, the covenant of works. We'll see that. But for now, let's just understand that God made man in this original state. And I've only scratched the surface here. There's a reading that we've photocopied for you a number of chapters of Thomas Boston of Manton's book, Human Nature in its Fourfold State. So you read some of this in a lot more detail. Yeah. But that's how God made man. Perfect, righteous, knowledgeable, perfectly aligned with God, yet losable. And then God says, okay, here's what I've given you. Do you want to be confirmed in it? Yes, obey this law. If you don't obey, everything is broken. So these are the beautiful endowments that constitutes man's original righteousness. And this is a creature that God is going to enter into covenant with. He's a competent creature, isn't he? Very competent. So we'll go for a lunch break now. It's now